You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Great solos don't make a symphony. In music or AI, get AI that's in tune with your business at IBM.com. The AI built for business, IBM.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 494 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich, and Tracy won't be with us this week. She has a bit of a summertime cold, although it hasn't really felt like summer lately here in Colorado. It's felt more like fall, actually. Anyway, Tracy has a cold, but we'll soldier on. As you guys will recall, by the end of the last episode, we'd wrapped up our discussion of the fight at Hawes' Shop on May 28th, 1864, which happened after the two armies had left the North Anna, and as both Lee and Grant were trying to get a fix on the whereabouts of the enemy. After the clash at Hawes' Shop, both sides had what they needed, though. From prisoners, Confederate Cavalry General Wade Hampton discovered that the Federals' 5th and 6th Corps had definitely crossed the Pamunkey River. And from Rebel prisoners, Phil Sheridan learned the positions of Anderson's and Ewell's Corps. So at 6 p.m. that evening, Robert E. Lee brought Confederate Secretary of War James Seddon up to date on the situation. His army, he wrote, was in front of Atlee's Station on a line extending toward Totopotomoy Creek. He'd heard nothing to suggest the Yankees had crossed the creek. Instead, he believed that Grant was assembling his army behind it. Lee passed along the report about the location of the Federals' 5th and 6th Corps, adding cautiously, "I have not, however, received very definite information as yet, either as regards their positions or numbers." End quote. Well, even so, the presence of two enemy corps south of the Pamunkey strongly suggested that Grant was concentrating his entire army around Hanovertown, which meant Lee could quit worrying about a Union thrust directly toward Richmond from the north. But the intelligence Lee had on hand did little to clarify Grant's intentions. From Hanovertown, the Yankees could march northwest, keeping the Totopotomoy between themselves and Lee, then hit the Virginia Central Railroad near Ashland, and in that way threaten Lee's left flank. Or the Federals could advance to the southeast, cross the Totopotomoy lower down, pick up the Old Church Road, and threaten Lee's right. Or they could come straight at Lee to engage him here in his current position. In any case, whatever Grant did, Lee would have to react quickly. With Richmond only 9 miles to his rear, Robert E. Lee was running out of maneuvering room. If Grant got around him on his flanks, or scored a breakthrough here, the result would almost certainly be the loss of the rebel capital city. As he mulled over the current state of affairs, Robert E. Lee's thoughts turned, as they had repeatedly since the campaign began, to the prospect of reinforcements. It was true that his situation in this regard had improved since Spotsylvania. Breckinridge had come from the valley, and Pickett's division was finally back with the army, and one brigade had arrived from the division of Robert Hoke. But nevertheless, the enemy army still enjoyed superior numbers. so Lee needed all the troops he could get. But only two sources of manpower remained to him: the Richmond garrison and PGT Beauregard's force at Bermuda Hundred. As Lee saw it, Beauregard was the key. In a real sense, the Richmond garrison and the Bermuda Hundred force were intertwined, since any reduction in the garrison would have to be made up by Beauregard. And to be sure, the Creole general had indicated a willingness to join forces with Lee, albeit on his own terms. A memorandum sent from Beauregard's headquarters to Braxton Bragg in Richmond on May 18th had proposed, quote, "If General Lee will fall back behind the Chickahominy, engaging the enemy so as to draw him on, then General Beauregard can bring 15,000 men to unite with Breckinridge and fall upon the enemy's flank with over 20,000 effectives, thus rendering Grant's defeat certain and decisive." End quote. Well then, having beaten Grant, Beauregard's and Lee's combined forces would turn on Butler's Army of the James and drive it away from Richmond as well. But Jefferson Davis vetoed the proposal as too problematic, and as a result, Beauregard was reluctant to part with any troops at all. However, hoping perhaps to capitalize on Beauregard's desire to play the role of rescuer, Lee concluded a May 28th dispatch to Davis by saying, quote, "Whatever Grant does, I shall endeavor to engage him as soon as possible, and will be near enough to Richmond for General Beauregard to unite with me, if practicable. Should any place nearer to Richmond be more convenient to him, and he will designate it, I will endeavor to deliver battle there." Well, Jefferson Davis knew that Lee needed reinforcements badly and wanted to help him if at all possible. Unfortunately, the situation at Bermuda Hundred was delicate. Yes, the Federals had been thwarted there, but their Army of the James hadn't been defeated and was still intact and safe behind earthworks. The Yankees could stir themselves and emerge at any moment, and if they overwhelmed Beauregard's forces, Richmond's rail connections with the rest of the Confederacy would soon be cut. And while Davis held Robert E. Lee in far greater esteem than PGT Beauregard, the Confederate president nevertheless understood that, just as Beauregard bore responsibility for the defense of his sector, so too he must have authority over the troops under his command. And so, save for the direst of emergencies, Davis thought it would be wrong to order Beauregard to send Lee reinforcements. It was better, Davis thought, to let Beauregard make the decision to send Lee help on his own. Jefferson Davis therefore forwarded Lee's dispatch to Beauregard, sending it in the hands of a trusted aide who could not only deliver it, but could give the Creole general detailed information concerning the state of affairs on Lee's front and in Richmond. Jefferson Davis also gave the aide a short letter of his own. A report indicated that the Federals were preparing to leave Bermuda Hundred, and Davis wrote delicately but pointedly, quote, "If it be true, it will of course affect your own views in relation to the contents of General Lee's letter." Beauregard received both aid and letters and replied the next day, saying, quote, "The report you refer to of Butler breaking up his encampments in my front is only partially true and indicates probably a change of position, not a withdrawal of part of his forces. My force is so small at present that to divide it for the purpose of reinforcing Lee would jeopardize the safety of the part left to guard my lines and would greatly endanger Richmond itself." The next day, May 29th, Davis and Beauregard separately visited Robert E. Lee's headquarters, and Lee did what he could to pull loose some troops from the Bermuda Hundred sector. But again, Jefferson Davis was hesitant to order it if Beauregard considered it inadvisable, and for his part, Beauregard told Lee no. Well, that night, Lee, bowing for the moment at least to reality, sent a message to Davis telling him, quote, "In conference with General Beauregard, he states that he has only 12,000 infantry and can spare none. So if General Grant advances tomorrow, I will engage him with my present force." Ironically, at the same time that P.G.T. Beauregard was arguing to keep his present force at Bermuda Hundred intact, his opposite number, Benjamin Butler, had just lost his battle to do the same thing. You see, in the wake of Butler's setback at Drury's Bluff, two senior officers from the War Department, Brigadier Generals John Barnard and Montgomery Meigs, came down from Washington on a fact-finding mission made at Grant's request. Their job was to check on the condition of the Army of the James, decide if it could or should assume the offensive again, and if not, determine how many troops would be needed to hold the position there and how many could be sent to work directly with the Army of the Potomac. Well, as it turned out, Barnard and Meigs were impressed by the strategic possibilities of the position that Butler occupied, both to threaten Richmond and its rail connections to the rest of the Confederacy. And so they recommended that Butler resume the offensive. However, as we know, Ulysses S. Grant had already made up his mind to abandon the Bermuda Hundred operation. Therefore, to him, the only relevant part of their report was their estimate that a reduced force of some 10,000 troops could hold the position, and so Grant wanted the other 20,000 men to reinforce the Army of the Potomac. Even before learning of the contents of the report, Grant had instructed Halleck to have Butler put 18th Corps on transports and send it around the Virginia Peninsula to White House Landing on the Pamunkey River. However, the rapidly shifting situation on the North Anna led Grant to suspend that directive. But then, on May 26th, he reinstated it. Butler, of course, had to comply, but still he resisted the idea. Taking advantage of the fact it would take time to assemble the needed transports, he used the interim to undertake an offensive against the important rail hub of Petersburg, hoping to achieve enough of a victory to convince Grant to call off the transfer of troops, or to commit Baldy Smith's men so completely to the Petersburg operation that they couldn't easily be withdrawn. However, Butler's gamble failed, but only by a few hours. Late on the afternoon of May 28th, just as he was about to launch the strike against Petersburg, word arrived that enough transports had been gathered. So, reluctantly, Butler told Baldy Smith to put his command on the ships.
Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for the stay.
McCrispy strips are now at McDonald's. I hope you're ready for the most dippable chicken in McDonald's history. Dip it in all the sauces. Dip it in that hot sauce in your bag. Dip it in your McFlurry. Your dip is your business. McCrispy Strips at McDonald's.
On May 29th, the Army of the Potomac sidled closer to its opponent, but cautiously, since Grant still lacked, as yet, a detailed picture of Lee's dispositions. So far, only Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps and one division of Gouverneur K. Warren's 5th Corps had neared Totopotomoy Creek. Horatio Wright's 6th Corps was to the north, occupying a line between Hanover Courthouse and Crump's Creek. The bulk of 5th Corps and all of Burnside's 9th Corps were at Hawes' Shop. Sheridan's cavalry screened both flanks of the army. Meanwhile, Lee consolidated his line on Totopotomoy Creek. From west to east, it consisted of A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps, over by Shady Grove Church, followed by Breckinridge's slender division, then Richard Anderson's 1st Corps, and then on the right was 2nd Corps, now commanded by Jubal Early in place of the sick Dick Ewell. And Lee had high hopes for Early's tenure as 2nd Corps commander, since Ewell had disappointed Lee ever since Gettysburg. Old Baldy's conduct during the rest of 1863 had been lackluster, and his behavior during the present campaign had been undistinguished. True, Ewell had handled his corps effectively during the fighting in the Wilderness, but that took place largely outside Lee's observation, whereas Lee had personally witnessed 2 serious breakthroughs in Ewell's sector at Spotsylvania and had seen him become unhinged at the Muleshoe on May 12th, when he cursed his troops hysterically until Lee told him to get a hold of himself. Additionally, Lee had been unimpressed by Ewell's needless and costly decision to give battle at Harris's farm on May 19th. And so, when Ewell fell ill on May 26th and relinquished command to Early, his senior division commander, Lee seized the opportunity to get rid of him. On May 29th, Lee issued an order giving, quote-unquote, temporary command of 2nd Corps to Early, and he encouraged Ewell to take a leave of absence from the army to rest. In the coming days, Ewell would repeatedly insist that he was well enough to resume command of his corps, but each time Lee tactfully but firmly rebuffed him. Dick Ewell was out, and old Jube was in. Lee had respected this rather cold, hard-bitten West Pointer, who at 47 was a lifelong bachelor. Early had left the pre-war army and become a district attorney in Virginia. Starting out a colonel in the Confederate Army, old Jube had risen steadily through the ranks, commanding a brigade after 1st Manassas and a division from Antietam onward. Early exhibited a combination of aggressiveness and sound judgment that appealed to Lee, as well as an iron will. Jubal Early could make his men follow him, and he didn't much care how he did it, a trait he shared with Stonewall Jackson, whose talents Robert E. Lee sorely missed. From this point on, with James Longstreet convalescing after being seriously wounded by friendly fire in the Wilderness, Early would become Lee's most important lieutenant. After the war, Confederate artillery officer E. Porter Alexander wrote, quote, "In many of the federal accounts, it is assumed that Lee's attitude during the Overland campaign was strictly defensive. Perhaps it should have been, but all who were near him recognized that never in the war was he so ready to attack upon the slightest opportunity." Well, Porter Alexander was correct. Lee had been actively looking for a chance to strike the enemy a hard blow, and now, as an opportunity materialized, Jubal Early was to be his chosen instrument. On May 30th, rebel cavalry scouts reported that the enemy 6th Corps was gone from in front of Hanover Courthouse. That ended any threat that the Yankees might lunge toward the Virginia Central Railroad. Lee figured that instead, Grant would swing once again around the Confederate right and make for the Chickahominy River. Lee told Richard Anderson that if he was correct about Grant's intentions, then, quote, "This is just a repetition of their former movements. It can only be arrested by striking at once at that part of their force which has crossed the Totopotomoy in General Early's front." Well, the Federals who had crossed the creek in Early's sector belonged to Warren's 5th Corps. So Old Jube received discretionary orders to attack them if he thought that success was likely. Lee told Anderson to support Early. And to Early he said, quote, "We must destroy this army of Grant's before he gets to the James River. If he gets there, it will become a siege, and then it will be a mere question of time." Early got his troops on the move promptly, making use of 2 recently constructed military roads to shift his corps from Shady Grove Church Road to Old Church Road. Robert Rhodes' division was in the lead, followed by Stephen Dodson Ramseur, then John Gordon. In the early afternoon on May 30th, Rhodes' lead brigade, under George Doles, struck a Federal skirmish line just west of Bethesda Church. Rhodes put 2 brigades into line and shoved the Yankees eastward. Near Bethesda Church, he encountered a full enemy brigade, but in short order sent it flying as well. The Yankees vanished northward along Walnut Grove Church Road. Just beyond them were 2 additional brigades from Samuel Crawford's 5th Corps Division. These took to their heels as well. Federal artillerist Charles Wainwright described the scene in his journal, writing, quote, "I waited to see how much of an attack it was, which I soon found out, for in 5 minutes Hardin's brigade were running, and the other 2 divisions, finding the enemy on their flank, were rather indiscriminately hurrying back to the Shady Grove Road." Wainwright thought that if the rebels had continued their attack, they would have won the battle. But instead, there was a delay, during which 5th Corps Commander Gouverneur K. Warren was able to restore his line. As at Jericho Mill and the North Anna a week previously, the 5th Corps artillery salvaged the situation, greatly assisted by the fact that Jubal Early didn't have enough troops on hand to exploit the opportunity, since Gordon was still on the march and Ramseur was just arriving on the scene. Early wanted to continue the attack, but also wanted Anderson to assist by advancing a division from his corps along the Old Church Road to take the Yankees in the flank. The idea was to build a strong line at right angles to Warren's position and then smash his exposed flank. Unfortunately for the Confederates, communication between Early and Anderson wasn't ideal, so Anderson failed to carry out his part of the plan. In the meantime, Early waited. While he did, Ramseur, who had just come up, deployed his division for action. As he did so, though, Federal artillery targeted him with shot and shell, and so he sent a brigade under Edward Willis to clear out a battery that lay south of the Shady Grove Road. Willis did, only to discover that particular enemy battery masked 3 more farther north, as well as several regiments of Pennsylvanians. At 200 yards, the Federal cannon opened fire on the Confederates with blasts of canister. Then, as Willis pressed forward and closed the range, the Union infantry joined in too. The result, wrote one Confederate survivor, was, quote, "the heaviest and most murderous fire I had ever seen," end quote. The deadly Federal cannon and musket fire wrecked Willis's brigade and mortally wounded Edward Willis. Even so, the rebels got within 50 yards of the Union line before stopping. The historian of the 13th Pennsylvania wrote that, quote, "the slaughter was so sickening that Major Hartshoe leaped to his feet and called upon the enemy to surrender. Some hundreds did so. Rebels or no rebels, their behavior and bearing during the charge had won the admiration of their captors, who did not hesitate to express it." Casualties in Willis's brigade were appalling, approaching 60%. While the attack was a disaster, it nonetheless demonstrated that the Federal flank was held in strength, and without help from Anderson, Early had little chance of turning it. At least that's the way old Jube chose to explain things to Robert E. Lee. Quote, "If Anderson had moved down the road from Hunley's Corner, I think we could have struck the enemy a severe blow. As it is, we have to regret the loss of valuable officers and men in Willis's brigade, which I much deplore. The enemy was not discovered to be entrenched until the brigade was very close to his line, and the loss was sustained before reinforcements could come up." End quote. Grant's headquarters that afternoon were near Hawes' shop, and when Warren sent word he was being attacked, the General-in-Chief ordered demonstrations be made, especially by Hancock's Second Corps, along the Totopotomoy to relieve the pressure on Fifth Corps. Hancock was reluctant to do it, but complied nevertheless, and got all three of his divisions into action as darkness fell. But the attack lasted barely 30 minutes and made little headway. One heavy artillery regiment did manage to seize some rebel rifle pits, only to relinquish them when the order came to fall back. One other fight of note occurred on May 30th, and considering the chain of events it set in motion, it was arguably the most important of all. During the afternoon, a brigade of Confederate mounted infantry, commanded by Matthew Butler, probed northeast from a dusty intersection known as Old Cold Harbor. By the banks of Totopotomoy Creek, Butler's men got into a sharp little skirmish with a brigade of enemy horsemen from Alfred T.A. Torbert's division of Union Cavalry, which was posted to screen the Federal supply line to White House Landing. Butler's Confederates made some progress early on in the fight, but the Federals couldn't allow the enemy to threaten their supply line, so Torbert soon threw his entire division into the fray, making it 3 brigades against 1. And the Yankee horsemen not only forced Butler's Confederates away from Totopotomoy Creek, but pursued the rebels nearly to Old Cold Harbor. That outcome meshed with Grant's thinking as it had developed after 2 full days spent along the line of the Totopotomoy. For clearly no opportunity existed to break Lee's defensive line there. Just as plainly, however, Lee seemed inclined to maneuver outside his earthworks if he had the chance to do so, as the battle at Bethesda Church proved. Grant therefore decided to move southward, beyond Lee's right flank, with Baldy Smith's 18th Corps troops coming up from White House Landing and spearheading the shift. Grant felt sure that when Lee got wind of Smith's approach, he'd move forces into Smith's path to try and stop him. So, on the evening of May 30th, Grant told George Meade to order Sheridan, quote, with at least half a brigade, to swing down from the Union left and clear the way for Smith, end quote. According to an officer on Grant's staff, Horace Porter, Grant hoped that Lee might send an entire corps against Baldy Smith. In that case, Grant intended to, quote, move the whole army to the right and throw it between Lee and Richmond, end quote. There were even more coming, but 10,000 men of Smith's 18th Corps had already started to disembark at White House Landing after leaving Bermuda Hundred the previous day. There were limited docking facilities, so it was a slow process, but nonetheless, Smith's arrival meant Grant would soon have a 5th Infantry Corps to pit against Robert E. Lee's 3. And no one understood the implications of this better than Robert E. Lee, who now threw protocol out the window and wrote Beauregard directly for reinforcements. When Beauregard responded that the Confederate War Department would have to determine which troops, if any, could be spared from the Bermuda Hundred sector, well, Lee's patience finally gave way. That night he wired Jefferson Davis, saying, quote, General Beauregard says the department must determine what troops to send. The result of this delay will be disaster. Butler's troops, that is Baldy Smith's men, will be with General Grant tomorrow. Hoke's division, at least, should be with me by light tomorrow. End quote. Although as determined as any general officer on getting what he wanted/needed, Robert E. Lee seldom used words like disaster in official correspondence. Now, it worked on Jefferson Davis, who wasted no time in ordering Beauregard to help out. Well, actually, Beauregard had already thought better of his original response, and he'd ordered the transfer of Robert Hoke's division to Lee just minutes before the formal order from Davis arrived. Now, events, men on both sides understood, were moving toward a climax. The decisive battle, sought now for many days, was now almost certain to occur, and looking at a map, it would happen somewhere between Totopotomoy Creek and the Chickahominy River, and quite likely near a crossroads called Cold Harbor. That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Cold Harbor, Grant and Lee, May 26th to June 3rd, 1864, by Gordon C. Ray. Well, this is the 4th volume in Gordon C. Ray's series of books covering the spring 1864 campaign in Virginia. Each book in the series is just excellent and deserves a spot in your Civil War library. Don't forget you can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. Also at the website, you can find info on how to join the Strawfoot Brigade over at Patreon and support the podcast in that way, just like Nathan M., David R., Robert Y., and Eric C. have all done recently. Thanks, guys. And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care. Thanks, everyone. Bye.